Welcome to the Fiscal Physical Podcast. Join us each week as we sit down with the founder of Alchemy Wealth Management and author of Your Fiscal Physical, Ryan Nelson. Tune in to gain valuable insights and practical tips as we simplify complex financial concepts into digestible lessons. From budgeting to retirement planning, this podcast is your go-to resource for mastering financial literacy.
Welcome, everybody, to this week's episode of the Fiscal Physical Podcast. I am joined by the published author, Mr. Ryan Nelson. He has his book, Your Fiscal Physical, 7 Keys to Becoming Financially Fit. You can find that on Amazon. But right now, we are going to do a podcast episode. And Ryan, first off, how are you today?
Doing well. Yourself?
I am doing well, my man. I am still kicking. I have... Since this last episode was recorded, I've looked into a will. I haven't got one, but I've thinking about it, so I have that food for thought, and hopefully you guys can go check out the last episode we did on probate and will, get a little more knowledgeable on that. And this week we're going to talk about trusts. And something, I've said this so many times, like, you know, you see it in movies, you see it in different things about people talking about, oh, I'm setting up a trust, or I have a trust fund. And honestly, I don't really know what that means. Like, I don't know exactly what a trust is. And so from your book, Ryan, it breaks down trusts. And it was also one of those ones that I was reading, and I was like, all right, I'm going to need a little bit more insight into this here. So I'm hoping today you can break down this topic about what trusts are, maybe what trusts aren't, and kind of give everybody a little bit of knowledge here.
Yeah, let's do it. I find most people you're in a similar boat as most people. I mean, trusts are relatively, it can be complicated. It can be simple, can be complicated. Most people don't fully necessarily understand what they are, and maybe I'll use this as a great place to pause and say, probably only people who do fully understand them totally are going to be estate planning attorneys. And so,
sure.
Again, we'll do a little bit of education here, but don't take anything I say as gospel, and certainly consult your estate planning attorney before setting up any trust. And really, you're going to need them to set up the trust anyway. So
great call. Great call out.
Yep. But so let's talk about sort of almost the technical definition of a trust first, and then maybe more in layman's terms, what it kind of means and how it sort of works. But so a trust is a contract that creates a fiduciary relationship between the trustor and the trustee. Okay. So it's a contract that creates a fiduciary relationship between the trustor and the trustee. So now, clear as mud, right? Now,
sure. My head's spinning.
Looks like you fell asleep over there.
Yeah.
So I find, while this isn't necessarily perfectly true, I think I encourage sort of people to think about this as when you set up your trust, it's almost like setting up a different legal entity, right?
Okay.
And so it's kind of, to some degrees like a business. It can own assets, it can generate income, it can pay bills, right? But what we find is, like, from an estate planning perspective, sometimes these trusts can be used to transfer assets sort of generationally, or to making sure the assets get to the intended beneficiaries the way they want them to pass, right? And so what you'll often see, at least in my world with retirement planning, I mean, there's all sorts of different trusts out there that you could accomplish all sorts of different things, right? The most common trust I see, if you're listening to this podcast, hoping to get this, becoming a little more financially literate with the hopes of retirement, the most common trust I see is a revocable living trust. So this is a trust where the creators, or that's who we would call the grantors, have full rights and privileges of ownership to use the assets while they're still living. Okay, so you can put money into this trust, so this separate legal entity. So if I set up a trust for myself, I would put some assets in. So maybe I use my bank account. Let's say I have 50 grand in a bank account. I open a trust. I put the 50 grand in the trust. I can now still use that money effectively as my savings account. I have control of that trust while I'm still living. And then because the trust is revocable, so again, we're talking about a revocable living trust, because the trust is revocable, the grantors, or in this case, me, I can change or dissolve that trust at any time if I desire, right? So I could open up a trust, put my $50,000 in it. Now, this is where I find a lot of confusion is what does it mean to put $50,000 in the trust?
Yeah.
How do I
just going to say, I was like, what do you mean?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. Like, so what that
chest
means is, again, if we go back up to that confusing definition, a trust is a contract that creates a fiduciary relationship between a trustor and a trustee. So the trust is only a contract. That's all it is. So how am I putting a bank account in this contract? Like that gets kind of confusing, right? So the contract creates this, again, kind of think of it as this different legal entity almost. And what I'm doing, so if you wanted to put your let's say your savings account in the trust, right? Really, probably a more efficient way of saying that is putting it in trust name. And so right now, my savings account is in the name of Ryan Nelson.
Right.
Let's say I had a trust that was called the Nelson Family Trust. Then what I would do right now, the trust is set up, my savings account is set up as in the name of Ryan Nelson. I could go to the bank and say, no, I want to set up a new savings account. It's no longer in Ryan Nelson's name. Mm-hmm. It's in the Nelson Family Trust name. So I'd open a brand new account. It'd be a trust account, effectively, a savings account in trust name. It'd be, if you look at how that account's registered, it would be registered to the Nelson Family Trust. And then I'd transfer my $50,000 from my Ryan Nelson savings account into my Nelson Family Trust savings account. And now the assets are held in an account where the owner is the trust.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely does. Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, oftentimes if you just set up a trust, so if you go to your estate planning attorney, they create that contract and you set up the trust, that then it really put assets into the trust. You then want to go call your financial advisor, go to your bank, right? Depending on what assets you want in the trust, then we might need to open you up new accounts here, or like if you were a client of Alchemy Wealth, we'd need to open a new account for you. And open you up a trust account now instead of maybe the typical brokerage account we had you in. We'd open it up in the trust, whatever the new trust name is, and transfer the assets over to that new account that's in trust name.
Awesome. That is cool, man. Because I was wondering how the money gets there, I guess. Like as far as like, hey, opening up a trust, like I'm like, all right, cool. But that kind of marries like the financial planning or the financial advisor potentially their part in this, if you will. So.
Yeah, and so it's not that common, but definitely I've seen it more than I would want, where somebody opens up, they have a trust, but they don't have, but they haven't then put their assets in trust name. Mm-hmm. And so again, the trust is only valuable if the assets are in the trust's name. So setting up the trust with your estate planning attorneys half the battle. Going back and doing your due diligence to make sure all the accounts you want in trust name are actually in trust name. That's a second step that is really just as important as the first step, right? Both steps need to be done for it to be effective.
Yep, without a doubt, man. And as far as this goes, I know that coming into this conversation, not really anymore, but I'm going to still say it. Like, I feel like I kind of thought that a will and a trust were almost like the same thing, but so I don't know if you can kind of break down like the big differences between them. If somebody's still like, what's the difference there?
So I would say a trust is more flexible. So if you, let's say I only had like one savings account, right? And we talked about trusts in the past, or we talked about wills in the past and how you can designate your beneficiary with it. And, if I don't have a will, the money's just going to go follow this kind of state's default plan. And so maybe that's, going to whoever, right? Mm-hmm. You could if you just had those assets and you wanted to go to a unique person, you could set up a will and you specify who you want them to go to. But if you wanted more flexibility with how you're distributing your assets, and maybe some special conditions, so some examples of that would be, maybe you have minor children and you don't just want them to get, you don't want to just leave them millions of dollars when they turn 18, right? Mm-hmm. Then you could, in a trust, you could specify exactly when they would receive the funds. So you could say, hey, maybe they need to be 25, or they'll start receiving distributions at 25 and get them between ages 25 and 35, or you give them one small lump sum at 25, another lump sum at 30, another lump sum at 35, right? And you can also have stipulate special conditions. So you could say, hey, maybe you set up your trust to give them, a certain amount of cash flow every month while they're at a certain age. But then you can also stipulate you want those payments to be paused if the recipient abuses illegal substances or something, right? If somebody's abusing illegal substances, it's not good for them or for the trust for them to be getting a steady income, right? Mm-hmm. So these are just extra things that you can stipulate in a trust that you would not be able to do with a will alone. That said, typically if you go, again, I'm not an estate planning attorney, but I know enough to be slightly dangerous. When you consult your estate planning attorney and you say, hey, if they determine that a trust is appropriate for your needs and you establish a trust, they're very likely also at the same time going to give you a will. So you would have both a will and a trust. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive. And that will could be what we call a pour over will. And what happens is the will would kind of say, hey, if there's anything that I forgot to put in the trust.
Sure.
So I didn't get into the trust name. I forgot to get it into trust name. This will would now take precedence and say, who do you want to be the beneficiary of this account? The trust, right? Mm-hmm. So now you have the trust and then you have a will, and the will sort of communicating I want all my assets that aren't in the trust already to flow to the trust. Sure. And make the trust the beneficiary. So oftentimes you'll see those used in conjunction where somebody will have both that, the trust and the will.
Awesome. That is a heck of a breakdown, man, because that definitely kind of shows how they can both, like you said, be mutually exclusive potentially, like as far as that goes, and the flexibility that you get from a trust is very interesting. Like, so that's an interesting piece of it. Of like, oh, you can, if it's the revocable one, you can pause it because life changes as you get older and whatever it might be, or the people that you're giving it to, like whatever, like. So that is great. An excellent breakdown of how those can be mutually exclusive, but also separate, and what they each kind of accomplish, if you will.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
So awesome. Well, great, Ryan. Appreciate that, man. We'll go ahead and take a quick pause here and be back on the other side of this. Everybody hang tight.
And now, to put the personal in personal finance.
Welcome to the personal section of the Fiscal Physical podcast. I am here still with Ryan Nelson. And Ryan, I got a question for you here. And it's one that's, I don't know, maybe a tough one to answer. I don't know how you want to phrase this, but I'm going to throw it to you. Like, what's the biggest risk you've taken in your life so far? I think are you 34? Is it?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So you're 34 years young. What would you say the biggest risk you've taken is?
Yeah, it's a really, really hard question. I don't really know. In risk, I don't even know exactly what risk means in this context, but I would say a couple of different risks. I mean, going out and doing an Ironman swim and just being fearful for my life. That was probably the biggest risk I ever put my life in, right? Going out swimming a couple miles.
Is it 2 miles? Is it how?
So Ironman 70.3, which is like a half Ironman, that's 1.2 miles. A full Ironman is 2.4 miles.
2.4.
And most of the ones we've done have been in the ocean, so you're swimming through like break and stuff. But obviously, you train for it, and you should. I kind of say that in jest. You should be well prepared. It shouldn't really be a risk, but certainly it kind of feels like a risk when you're getting into the water, or you look out and you're like, there's a buoy a mile, 1.2 miles away, and you're like, God, I gotta swim out to that and then swim back.
That's the piece that gets me.
One of the ones we did, we were like swimming through jellyfish and stuff. So, I don't think you're really at that big of a risk, but people do unfortunately pass during those. And, so it's just, certainly there is some risk, but I don't know that that's really what you were getting at. But, from a personal standpoint, I'd say, so I got my undergrad in mechanical engineering, was in engineering, and really loved engineering as a career, but decided to make the move from engineering to financial advice. Making that career jump, I think, was certainly a risk. Mm-hmm. Whether it was my biggest risk or not, I'm not sure, but certainly that was a big risk, and I just kind of followed something I thought I would be happier doing. Mm-hmm. And at that time, again, I think engineering is sort of perceived publicly as being pretty prestigious and stuff.
Sure.
And so that was, again, I had a lot of people kind of questioning why I would do that. If you look up the data for financial advice, there's a lot of people who don't make it as building a financial advisory practice. Only somewhere between like 5 and 10% of people, depending on what data you look at, but around 5 to 10% of people who start as a financial advisor are still a financial advisor 3 years later. Has a high failure rate, and I had a good kind of cushy job as an engineer. So certainly that was a big risk, but obviously glad I took it.
Yeah, definitely, man. And that's, I remember when you were making that transition or thinking about making that transition, and you talked about like going like door to door.
Oh,
and, doing these certain things. And I was just like, oh my gosh. Like, but I also feel like sometimes with you, and it's similar to myself too, when someone tells me like, I'm like, oh, like nobody can do this, or like it's like very low odds or something like that. But if it's something I want to do, it almost just like fuels me more.
Yeah, for
I'm
sure.
like, nah, I can do this. Like, I can figure it out. Like,
easy.
No problem. Like I've done worse or whatever. So like, I think that's a piece that is built into you, and also it built into me to a little extent. When someone tells me I can't do something, I'm like, I can.
For sure. Like, what would you say is your biggest risk?
Yeah, when you hit it right on the head. When I put this question in, for some reason at the time, I thought it was a really good question. And then I was like, well, let me break it down and let me think of what's my risk. Are we talking risk tolerance? Are we talking like, dangerous to my life risk? And I don't, I think, but there's two things that stand out in my head. Like, the first one was when I went to undergrad at the University of Idaho up in Moscow, Idaho, and I wasn't really doing much my first couple of years, and I was like, you know what, I'm just going to go study somewhere. I'm going to go study abroad somewhere, and I was like, you know what, Costa Rica sounds nice, and I just picked that country, and I was like, you know what, I'm signing up for a full year. Let's do it.
Nice.
And didn't really at the time speak Spanish. Like I had taken a couple of college classes or something, and just kind of, I remember when I got off the airplane in San Jose, Costa Rica, I was like 24 hours of travel at the time. I was just, brain didn't work.
Yeah.
You're in this foreign country, you don't speak the language, it's raining, it's dark, you're just like, oh my God, what did I do?
Right.
And I'm thinking, I was like, this is a terrible idea. And so like looking back on that, like, yes, I was safe or whatever, but I was like, that was kind of a risk because I didn't know if I could like do
that's
it.
a huge risk.
And as a 20-year-old kid, like, all right, cool, let's go somewhere where you don't speak the language, don't know anybody, and it ended up working out pretty well.
Absolutely.
Second one I would think about is moving down to Reno when I was like 22. I had like $400 in my bank account, like super poor, and I was like, but I had like kind of a place set up to live, but like not really. And then like just driving down with all my possessions, like in my Ford Taurus vehicle, including like my mattress folded up. And I remember like I going through like Winnemucca, and I was like 2 hours away, and I was like, holy cow, like this is everything that I own in my life is right here. Like I have not a lot. Like, and so just that. And obviously that was, 11 years ago, something like that. And it's worked out all right. So, however you want to categorize risk, I was like, worked out in the end. So I think that, those would be two of the examples that I could think of.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love it.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it, Ryan. As always, thank you so much to our listeners out there. Please like, subscribe, follow wherever you get your podcasts at. And if you have any questions, please let us know. podcast@alchemywealth.com. And Ryan, any final words here, my man?
As always, stay the course.
Thank you for joining us for the Fiscal Physical Podcast. Until next time, happy listening. And as always, stay the course. If you have a question or topic suggestions, please email us at podcast@alchemywealth.com. If you enjoyed today's discussion, subscribe to the podcast to ensure you never miss an episode. And consider leaving us a rating and review on your favorite platform. This helps other listeners like you find the show. For more resources, you can visit Alchemy Wealth Management's website at www.alchemywealth.com or find your Fiscal Physical, the book, on Amazon. We'd be remiss if we didn't mention that personal finance is just that, personal. Please don't take anything we say as advice. The preceding content is for informational and entertainment purposes only. It's not an offer or a solicitation, nor should it be construed or relied upon for tax, legal, or investment advice. It doesn't consider your personal financial situation or objectives and may not be suitable for you.